Thank you all for coming tonight, and it's going to be a great show. How many Mahre family do we have here? Raise your hands. Somehow related. Woo! That is great. Yeah, I don't think you saw the great-grandchildren, too. They didn't raise their hands, so there's even more than that. Fellow Mountaineers and friends, I have known W.D. Frank. You're going to hear a lot about Dave Mahre, but I'm going to start out with W.D. Frank, who's going to be talking about Dave. I've known him for most of my life, graduating together with glorious honors from Roosevelt Elementary School, Franklin Junior High School, and Eisenhower High School. Let's put it up for those of Yakima, huh? Woo! Give it out. We shared experiences learning to hike, climb, and ski in Troop 9. And W.D. then went to the University of Michigan and Stanford, and then earned a PhD from the University of Washington. In between, he helped to manage his family's fruit business, became fluent in Russian, competed in the U.S. Olympic trials in the biathlon, and was a hands-on father to 2 wonderful sons. The guy's never busy at all. Not one to sit idle, he combined skiing and mountaineering to make the first ski descent of the north face of Mount Adams on the Adams Glacier. While teaching at Central Washington University, he wrote his first book, Everyone to Skis. The book traced how the Russian army learned from its near disaster invading Finland. They didn't learn anything too much, right? And the need to form a cross-country ski military unit, which unit helped to defeat the Germans when the invasion by Germany was caught up in the winter time. He then translated from the Russian a second book called Skis and the Art of War, and a third for the museum exhibit, which is for sale up in the gift shop if you want. It's called Let's Take the Sporting Route. And W.D. was the chief editor for that and wrote many of the articles about the accomplishments of Central Washington mountaineers, including Dave. He is now writing a 4th book on the history of the Double K Ranch. Having known him all my life, I still was surprised when a friend talked about what a great teacher Dr. Frank was up at Central and how he had lit a fire under his study efforts, especially in history. Professor Frank apparently had many in his classes entranced by his lectures. Since then, I have had a chance to actually hear W.D. teach and give lectures. And you're in for a treat tonight because there's not many speakers, and especially historians, who have all their facts straight, can weave a story, and speak to their audience, and can elicit moments of insight. Dr. Frank can do it all. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you my friend, W.D. Frank, who will be talking about Dave Mahre's place in Central Washington mountaineering.
Wow, thanks, Frank.
No pressure at all with that introduction and all the entire Mahre clan here. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. I'm just going to grab my water real quick. A little nervous. While I do that, before we get started, I have to acknowledge many people, especially who were on our committee to get the exhibit going, who I depended on for the information you're going to hear tonight. Especially Kathy Foreman, who, there she is, hi Kathy, who gave us access to Dave Mahre's photographs, was also a liaison to the Prater family so that we could use Gene and Bill's photographs. Crucial to this talk tonight. My colleague Gordon King, who did a lot of the work for getting the biography of Dave Mahre in order and all of his accomplishments. Also, let's see, I wrote a few other people down here. Oh yeah. We want to make sure to acknowledge Craig, of course, for helping to get the exhibit going and for helping us to organize this talk, along with Peter Arnold of the museum. And especially I'd like to thank Fred Stanley, who couldn't be here tonight. I wish he were, but he couldn't. And Fred Dunham. I thought I saw Fred roaming around. Fred, are you here? There you are. Okay. Thanks, Fred. These guys, Fred, the two Freds knew Dave, and the information I gathered from them about his life is extremely helpful. So, we are going to jump right into it, ladies and gentlemen. I've got a lot to cover. As you can imagine, I think this is going to work. Nope. Slide on. There we go. Okay, so it's this one. Okay. So we're going to talk about, of course, Dave Mahre tonight, who was just a remarkable alpinist. He was an avant-garde, on the forefront, advanced the knowledge and the ability to climb in the alpine style here in central Washington, and influenced climbing throughout North America. It's a type of climbing that is everybody does now in the 21st century, but when he was doing it, it was considered just beyond the pale. And we're going to go into detail about that tonight. That's backwards. Okay, I'll get this figured out. I got a lot of slides. If you go through the guidebooks to the high routes and the climbing routes of North America, of the central Washington, and if you look at an area that's circumscribed by Mount Stewart on the north, Mount Rainier on the west, Mount Adams on the south, and our little town of Yakima, these are the remarkable climbs that Dave Mahre is accredited with. And these are some really, really bold undertakings. And this was done from the middle of the 1950s, 1955, into the late 1960s. An incredible amount of climbing done from a guy who had a full-time job, who raised a large family, was devoted to both family and his job, climbed on the weekends or when he could make time, and was able to do all of this incredible work in the mountains. He took a break in the 70s, I think at the behest of his mother, or of his wife, Kathy's mother, Mary, and didn't go out and try to do these bold climbs because of, he had this family to raise and he had a job to hold down, and went back at it into a changed atmosphere in mountaineering. And I want to talk about that changed atmosphere a little bit. That changed atmosphere was a chapter of the book that I really wanted to write, but I could never formulate it very well. So you get to hear me talk about it tonight, because thinking about doing this lecture for Dave, I thought it all came together, and I think it will be very interesting for you to listen to about how when he came back to climbing in the 1980s, he came back to an atmosphere in mountaineering that was totally different from the one that he had helped develop in the 50s and 60s. But when he came back to mountaineering in the early 1980s, he came back with a bang, and he was on 2 expeditions to Mount Everest in the Himalaya. He got within breathing distance of the summit and would have probably summited had it not been for the death of his climbing companion, Marty Hoey, which scuttled the entire expedition. He went back as a support climber 2 years later at the age of 57, and then at the remarkable age of 69, which, ladies and gentlemen, if you are of my vintage, it's hard enough just to climb in and out of bed. each day, but he summited Denali, Mount McKinley, up in Alaska. This guy was incredible. Oh, and he worked as a guide for RMI up on Mount Rainier in his spare time. Now, he had two famous sons, of course, Phil and Steve, and he sort of faded into the background. His accomplishments in the mountains were sort of forgotten about. With Phil and Steve's remarkable career as ski racers, which started in the late 70s on the International World Cup, and of course, as you know, with the gold and silver medals in slalom at the Sarajevo Games of 1984. But I don't think this really was of much concern to Dave. Dave was a very modest man. He didn't really talk about his climbing all that much. He would talk to you about it if you asked him, which I did on occasions, but he wasn't one to brag about it, and I know he was very proud of his sons. But in that time period, Phil and Steve were very famous, and even though Dave was going to Mount Everest and whatnot, it really did take a back seat to their accomplishments. I want to talk to you a little bit before we get started about where does this title of the book and the exhibit come from. This is related to Dave Mahre because when Gordon was doing his research on Dave, he was combing through Cascadian annuals. Cascadians is a local climbing club. And Gene Prater wrote this about Dave Mahre. He showed a frightening interest in what one would call sporting routes, tongue-in-cheek. This was a description he was writing about a route on the north face of Mount Stewart. And he definitely was interested in sporting routes. Here's a picture of Dave and Gene Prater, his friend from Ellensburg, longtime climbing companion, on the summit of Mount Adams, featuring Dave's broken ice axe, which he sustained in a fall off of some vertical ice. Sporting route indeed. Now, the next thing I wanted to just bring up, and this is where we're going to veer off a little bit, how did we come up with this time frame, 1949 to 1970? Now, as an historian, I'm always interested in recreating the world that we're studying. When we look back in history, it's not just what somebody did, when they did it, and who they did it with, but what was the environment that they lived in that allowed them to develop as they did. So we have to think about looking back at history, because at my age, looking back from 2022 to 1960, right in the middle of this time period we're going to talk about, it's the same as, and I was cognizant of life in 1960 and thinking about what things were like in the past, and looking back from 1960, 62 years was 1898. Cars had barely even been developed, and we're talking about the Spanish-American War. So these time periods are gigantic, and as we go along in our life, we don't realize how much things change over the decades. And this is something we always have to keep in mind when we're writing history. And this is especially the case when we consider mountaineering in the 21st century. Now, if you were watching the Olympics when they were broadcast from Tokyo last summer, you know that sport climbing was a medal event. Sport climbing is an offshoot of rock climbing, and rock climbing is part of mountaineering. This is what Dave Mahre was doing in the 50s and 60s, but now it's an Olympic event on artificial rocks. Similarly, in 4 years at the Winter Games in Cortina, ski mountaineering is going to be an Olympic event. Now, even if you're not one of the highly paid professional athletes who partake in these events, even if you are a highly skilled alpinist, you can make a pretty good living at it these days. There are prizes that are awarded. The Piolet d'Or is an example. There are sponsorships from companies. There are grants that you can get. So, you know, you don't have to work. I mean, your job is going out and climbing in the mountains. A pretty good gig. But this wasn't the case back in the time period we're talking about. Now, the earlier parameter, 1949, we chose because that's when the Cascadian Climbing Club reorganized after World War II. Are the Cascadians here tonight? All right. I said, are the Cascadians here tonight? Yeah, okay. All right. Well, the Cascadians reorganized in 1949 after World War II. Cascadians had first organized in 1920 because there was a lot of interest in going to the mountains from Yakima. I mean, we live in a great place, and people realized it back then. And, you know, there was no air conditioning, right, back in the 1920s, and when it got hot in the summer, you went up in the mountains to cool off. So there was a lot of activity. And we live in the shadow of Mount Adams, as William O. Douglas pointed out in 1949. We see it when it's not cloudy. We see it every day. And Dave Mahre even writes that this inspired him to go climbing. And he eventually did go to Mount Adams, and this is where he met Lex Maxwell, who was at the time very involved with the Cascadians, and suggested to Dave that if he didn't want to kill himself in the mountains, he should join the Cascadians too and learn the proper technique for climbing. Jeff Hagan asked me to remind you that Dave Mahre was president of the Cascadians in 1954 and 1955, and also that he provided artwork for the Cascadian annuals. And you can see an example of that in our book for sale up at the gift shop. So 1949 is the year that we started. Now, right after the reestablishment of the Cascadians, there was a huge interest all around the world in the big peaks, in the Himalayan peaks, because in 1953, Sir Edmund Hillary at the time from New Zealand and Tenzing Norgay made it to the summit. And this set off just a huge interest in this, because this was the last unconquered part of the world. Prior to World War I, there was a big push to get to the North Pole and to the South Pole. And this was really a big deal. And once that happened, in the interwar period, Mount Everest was considered the third pole of the world. And this is where all the funding from Great Britain, from the European countries, all the funding went to getting to the top of Mount Everest. And finally, it happened in 1953. And then there was this explosion of interest in mountaineering. And it was filtering into the consciousness of the general public in the United States. In 1963, Americans went to Mount Everest. And this generated even more interest. And there were several members of this Everest expedition team from the state of Washington. Most famously, of course, Jim Whittaker, first American on the summit of Mount Everest, but also Barry Prather from Ellensburg, who went initially as a glaciologist, but then was recruited later in the expedition to be a high-altitude climber, and was actually on his way to the South Col to get a shot either at the Everest summit or Lhotse, its neighboring peak. But he suffered from high-altitude sickness and had to descend to base camp. So anyway, there was a huge interest in the United States with this, and big interest here, because I remember with the Boy Scout troop that Jim Whittaker came and talked at a church downtown, and it was like, well, I didn't know what he was talking about. Tell you the truth. I mean, Mount Everest, Nepal, I mean, I didn't know what that was. But around the world, around the United States, big deal. Now today, going to Mount Everest, it's not so big deal. you can sign up and go, and if you have enough money, and I mean a lot of money, you can go too. But back then, only the cream of the crop got to go on these expeditions to Mount Everest. This wasn't the case for Dave Mahre and his buddies back in the day. If you were going to go up into the mountains, you were going to go to the Army-Navy surplus stores and get the equipment that was left over from World War II in Korea. You could get some European mountaineering items from REI, which was established in 1935 in Seattle, or you could go right down the street here to Sarge Hubbard's, and he had everything you could ever possibly need to go up and go climbing on Mount Rainier. But there was something going on in California at the same time. In California, there were a lot of people who, because there was an economic boom after World War II, and there was a lot of money and a lot of leisure time, especially in California, and there were people who were interested in outdoor lifestyles, getting outdoors. And this, there's an adage that California leads the country by at least a decade. And in California, there was interest in, going up to the Sierra Nevada to go camping, going up and skiing at Lake Tahoe area, up in the mountains in the winter, and on the coast, surfing. And surfing really caught on in the United States. Now, back in the day, if you wanted to be a surfer, you actually had to live on the coast, right? You either lived in California or you lived in Hawaii, and that's where you learned how to surf. And in those days, you used long boards. It was a very difficult sport to master. So the people who could actually do the sport, there was just a handful of them in the world, really. But that didn't stop people from wanting to aspire to being surfers. They wanted to look like they could surf. And Madison Avenue picked up on this, right? And there was a lot of money to be made providing consumers in the United States with the accoutrements of the surfer. And this generated a lot of money in the early 60s. At the same time as the surfing phenomenon was going on the coast, there was a group of climbers, contemporaries of Dave Mahre, who were doing big routes in Yosemite Valley. These were guys who devoted their time to straight-on rock climbing on the hardest routes they could find. Now, not a lot of people were that interested or had the ability to do the climbing, but they were doing it in one of the most popular national parks in the United States, and people could see them doing it. This is different than what was going on up here in the Pacific Northwest, where, when you would go climbing on Mount Stewart, nobody knew you were there, right? You were just climbing. But in Yosemite, you kind of had an audience. And these guys, they were handsome guys, and they dressed in a certain way, and people wanted to emulate that look, even though they couldn't walk from the car to the base of El Capitan. But they wanted to look like they could. And Madison Avenue, the wheels were starting to turn because of this surfing phenomenon. Now, in the middle of the decade, of course, there was the counterculture movement, and I don't really need to go into too much detail on that. Suffice it to say that this was anti-Madison Avenue. They were, the hippie movement wanted to live as cheaply as possible, get back to the land, take lots of drugs, listen to rock and roll, et cetera, et cetera. But this had a huge influence on the United States as well, culminating, of course, with Woodstock in 1969, where 500,000 young people showed up to, to live the hippie lifestyle. This too, Madison Avenue got wind of, and even if you if you weren't a hippie, if you were an accountant in Des Moines, Iowa, but you wanted to associate yourself with the hippie movement, you could buy clothing to sort of look like that. One other thing that was going on down there was the environmental movement, which was part of the development of the Sierra Club. With this increased leisure activity and money after the war, more and more people were joining the Sierra Club and became interested in going to the areas they were trying to preserve, and became incensed that mining and logging interests were destroying the pristine mountains that they loved to visit. So this had a huge influence as well. And one last thing that was going on was the idea of long-distance travel, using the equipment that the mountaineers were using, and living on the open road. Now, back in this time period, in the 60s, it's hard to believe, but you could just walk out to the highway, stick out your thumb, and get a ride all the way across the United States, and live to tell about it. And so this was a lot of people did this, and it was especially associated with the hippies. Now, in Europe, the movement that had started in California, the countercultural movement, had a huge impact. And there was a long-distance route that you could take from London, England, all the way across Europe, through the Middle East, this is before the Islamic revolutions, and get all the way to Kathmandu, Nepal, which is where all the big mountains were. And there was also hashish and marijuana, plentiful, cheap, and legal, which it wasn't in the rest of the world. So it was very attractive to the hippies. So there was an interest in vagabonding. Now, you are probably wondering, what are you talking about? We're here to talk about Dave Mahre. What are you doing? What are you talking about? Okay, there's a reason. Because there was a group of 5 guys in California who combined all of this stuff that was going on in California into one giant burrito of a road trip that they took from Ventura, California, loaded up a van with their ski gear, their surfboards, their climbing equipment, their vagabonding gear, and they just took off south, down through Central America, down through South America, to Patagonia in Argentina to climb Fitzroy. They wanted to be the third party to climb Fitzroy. And on this trip were 3 important people to my story. Doug Tompkins, founder of North Face and Esprit clothing line. Chris Jones, who was an author, and we'll get to him a little bit later. And Yvon Chouinard. I think many of you know who Yvon Chouinard was. He was a guy who had a foundry in Ventura, and he was making hardware, climbing hardware for the climbers going to Yosemite, pitons and that sort of thing. And he eventually founded a very famous clothing line named after the region that they traveled to in 1968. Now, Doug Tompkins opened a store in 1960, or he founded a business in 1964 to import hardware, climbing equipment from Europe for climbers going to Yosemite, and he wanted to have soft goods as well, tents, packs, sleeping bags. So he started to contract with people to get those into his store. And the business took off, and he opened a store in San Francisco in 1966. And because he was tuned in to what was going on in Haight-Ashbury, he got the quintessential counterculture band, the Grateful Dead, to play at the store opening in 1966. And that is a store opening I would have loved to have been at. That must have been something. But he was getting some of his soft goods from a couple of other hippies up in Berkeley, California, George Marks and Bob Swanson. These 2 guys had founded a company called Sierra Designs in 1965. Now, these guys were designers, and they made really good mountaineering tents, sleeping bags, packs, that sort of thing. And so Doug Tompkins was buying their stuff and selling it in his store. And these two guys were really brilliant. They designed great stuff, and they had this idea that you could sell what they were making in a catalog and sell it all over the country. So that's what they did. And their business took off, and then they had a really great idea in 1968. They found this fabric called 60-40 fabric, 60% nylon, 40% cotton, and they started making a mountain parka, which was a useful garment you could wear anywhere. You could wear it in the mountains, you could wear it skiing, you could wear it around town and look really fashionable. And you could look pretty cool because you were associating with, this outdoor lifestyle. And they marketed it through their catalog, and they made a killing on these jackets. They did so well that it attracted big money from the East Coast, and they sold Sierra Designs in 1971 to the CML Investment Group from Boston. And the last catalog that they produced, they took a professional photographer up to Bodie, California, which is a ghost town on the east side of the Sierra. And they took, instead of the lovely fashion models from Madison Avenue, they just took people who worked in the retail store, in the Berkeley retail store, and put them in the clothing and took pictures. And this really took off. This was really popular, because these are just normal people wearing these cool clothes. Now, the guy in the hippie in the purple jacket there with the long hair, this guy, you don't get to meet, I knew this guy, and you don't get to meet too many geniuses in your life, but this guy was a genius. This guy's name is Paul Kramer. He started working at the Berkeley retail store in 1970 after graduating from high school in Palo Alto. And the ideas that came out of his head, you're still using today. Probably some of the jackets, the tents, the sleeping bags that you own right now came out of Paul Kramer's head. He went on to run Sierra Designs. He left Sierra Designs in 1993 to found a company named Mountain Hardware. And he ran Mountain Hardware for 10 years and then sold it to Columbia Sportswear down in Portland for $36 million. Pretty good piece of business for 10 years running a company, I would say. But this tells you that what had started as this niche sport where you were importing gear from Europe and going to the Army-Navy surplus store to get outfitted had turned into a gigantic business starting in the middle of the 1970s. And people they couldn't buy enough stuff to make it look like they actually were at home in the mountains. So this is the reason we cut it off at 1970, because the 70s, the period during which Dave Mahre had sort of taken his break from big mountain climbing. He was helping with the mass climbs on Mount Adams, but nothing too outrageous. This really was a watershed decade in the start of a multi-million-dollar business, and it changed it forever, completely. It had a huge influence on another guy, another contemporary of Dave Mahre's, Fred Beckey, who was a climber from Seattle. And Fred Beckey approached climbing 180 degrees opposite to Dave Mahre, because Fred Beckey never had a job. Fred Beckey devoted his life and every waking moment to climbing, and he lived a Spartan dirtbag, his terminology, lifestyle. When Fred Beckey died in 2017, he had a cult following, and he was so famous that there was an obituary in the New York Times, and they said that Mr. Beckey shunned publicity and people. This isn't true. He loved publicity, and he wasn't shy about getting people to carry his stuff into the mountains. I saw him do it up on Mount Rainier. Starting when he was a teenager with the first climb of Mount Waddington up in British Columbia, he made sure that the press knew all about it. But he may not have had much of job prospects, but he was a brilliant writer. His books are classics. His 3-volume guide to climbing routes in the state of Washington are just brilliant. The history, the geology, the route descriptions, and this is where we got a lot of our information about the routes that Dave Mahre had done in our area. He is credited with over 1,000. He never, by the way, he was never married. He's credited with over 1,000, or around 1,000 first ascents in North America, which is just remarkable. And it will never be equaled or even approached. And his lifestyle sort of was modeled on this road trip that the Fun Hogs made in 1968, Chenard and his boys. Or, I don't know, maybe they were modeling the Patagonia catalog on him. He's featured in it quite a bit. I think that Chenard admired Fred Beckey's lifestyle, this total devotion to climbing. This is a famous picture of Fred Beckey that appeared, will belay for food. It's obviously a setup up by Lake Tahoe, holding up a sign as if he were at the Fred Meyer parking lot with his rope and helmet. But it's sort of epitomized, the dirt bag, total devotion to the sport lifestyle. But if you're going to do it, you want to be in some pretty nice Patagonia togs, right? But even after his death, Chenard was featuring Fred Beckey in his catalog. So he had, he was really famous, and he went after it. He really promoted himself. And there were other climbers from around here who did the same, because these companies were generating huge amounts of money, and they could sponsor trips to the big mountains, and they would outfit the climbers with their clothing, and there would be color pictures of the climbers in these spectacular places, and they'd bring the photographs back, and you'd put them in the catalog, and you'd sell more clothing. It was a great gig. But Dave didn't go in for that. Dave, for the 1982 China Everest expedition, he did do some publicity photos. JanSport was one of the sponsors. And, he went out there and he did it. He posed. But just, I don't know, just the look on his face, I don't know he was really that into it. You know what I mean? It looks like he's not feeling it, you know what I mean? And that's something that I really admire about Dave. Now, in this age where you have people who are blogging and they are influencers and they are posting about themselves, these are people that couldn't carry Dave Mahre's crackers, talking about their exploits in the mountains. It's a little bit disconcerting, but it's really wonderful to think that Dave Mahre was out there in 1955 to the late 1960s, just climbing, just because he loved it. This is something I admire very much about him. Now, how did Dave get his start? This is really an interesting story. And we are going to take a deep dive into this one climb, the second ascent of Liberty Ridge in 1955. Because Dave went on this climb with two other guys from Yakima, Marcel Schuster and Mike McGuire, and his pal, Gene Prater from up in Ellensburg. And what they did on this climb is introduce to North America some new techniques for climbing. Front pointing on crampons with 12 points, welded in the middle to make a solid platform so you could kick your toes into the snow and climb up, and leapfrogging in two-man rope teams. Now, I know you don't know much about that, but by the end of this evening, you're going to know a whole lot, because we're going to take a deep dive into these. But this one climb changed climbing in North America radically. And the this one climb, this Liberty Ridge climb, has become a classic. When two Yosemite climbers, Steve Roper and Alan Steck, wrote a book of 50 classic routes in North America. This is a book written in 1978. Liberty Ridge is one that made the cut, and it's the most elegant line on Mount Rainier, and it's a classic, and Dave Mahre is a big part of this climb. So we're going to talk about that right now. Now, the guy that led the climb was a friend of Dave's, Marcel Schuster. He was born in Dresden, Germany, and he learned to climb on the crags and the cliffs outside of Dresden as a boy. And by the time he was a teenager, he was climbing at a very advanced level in the Alps. And he was also a really great alpine ski racer. Now, when I interviewed Marcel up at White Pass back in the 80s, he told me that when he graduated from high school, he wanted to go to a hotel management school in Switzerland. But the National Socialist Party had taken over the levers of power in Germany, and the Nazis wouldn't let him out of the country until he had served in the army. So he was placed as an instructor with the Gebirgsjäger, the mountain troops of the Wehrmacht, of the German army, because of his advanced climbing skills. And he was teaching rock climbing and skiing to the Gebirgsjäger in the Bavarian Alps. When the war broke out, now this was training that was done based on what had happened in World War I, where there was a front between Italy and the Austro-Hungarian Empire that was carried out in the Alpine, where you needed to have really advanced mountaineering skills and ski skills to be able to carry out maneuvers. This never happened in World War II, but they were trained for cold weather warfare, and Marcel told me that they were assigned, his division was assigned to the Russian front up at the Arctic Circle on the Norwegian-Soviet border. I can't imagine a worse place to be. He said he spent a miserable winter outside, surrounded by the Soviets. He was captured by the Soviet troops and sent to a prisoner of war camp, where he remained for the rest of the war. After the war, he came back to Germany and he worked as a climbing guide in the Bavarian Alps. Then he immigrated to British Columbia, and he eventually ended up in the Kittitas Valley, and this is where he met Gene Prater and his wife Yvonne. I think they were Fred Stanley told me they met at the Swax Ski Bowl, skiing one day. And they the Praters realized that Marcel would be this wonderful addition to the climbing community that was growing up, in the Cascadians and with the Ellensburg climbers. So they contacted Lex Maxwell and Bob McCall, who was a 10th Mountain veteran, and who were very involved in climbing here in Central Washington, to sponsor Marcel to come down and live in Yakima. And he worked for United Builders for a few years, and then moved up to White Pass and ran the ski school. And I met him, I think he was working at the Yakima Ski Club. That's where I met him when I was a boy. And he was an amazing skier. I mean, to see Marcel ski on the crappy equipment we had in the 60s through Cascade Cement was really something. Now, Marcel was still interested in climbing, and he really was infatuated with the routes on the north side of Mount Rainier, especially the three major ridges, Curtis Ridge, Liberty Ridge, and Ptarmigan Ridge. And he really wanted to go up Liberty Ridge, the most elegant line on the mountain. Liberty Ridge had been climbed before in 1935 by a Rainier guide, Omi Daber, in a 3-day trip. This was a very bold undertaking for 1935. And he led two companions, Arnie Campbell and Jim Barrow, up the route. They came in from the northwest side of the park. They started at Mowich Lake, hiked into the Carbon Glacier, camped out, climbed the route on the second day. Took them all day. They bivouacked on the summit. Then on the third day, they came down the south side of the mountain, down what we would call the standard route now, down Disappointment Cleaver, and then through Camp Muir, to finish their trip at Paradise. Now, between the time that Omi Daber finished his trip and Marcel Schuster moved to Yakima, Highway 410 had been completed over Chinook Pass. And with that, climbers from Yakima could now access the north side of Mount Rainier without having to drive all the way around to Seattle and then come in from the west. You could drive to the White River, hike in through Glacier Basin, over St. Elmo's Pass, and straight over to the Carbon Glacier. So Marcel, who had a job and could only climb on the weekends, figured you could do it in 2 days. If you went in over St. Elmo's Pass, camped on the Carbon Glacier one day, got up as early in the morning as you possibly could, climbed the route, then come down the Emmons Glacier, which is on the east side of the mountain, and hook right back into Glacier Basin and exit out of the White River Campground, grab a hamburger, drive home, and you're back at work Monday morning. But it required a different kind of technique than those used by Omi Daber. What Omi Daber was doing with his group was standard mountain procedure that had been developed in the Alps in the middle of the previous century, in the 19th century, and was still de rigueur on all of the big mountains on the West Coast by all of the major climbing clubs in California, in Oregon, and in Washington State. That means that you have a 3-man rope team, and you move on the diagonal, zigzagging up the mountain with the lead climber, the blue circle, let's call that Omi Daber, leading his companions, Campbell and Barrow, up behind him. Now, as you move up, you're going to zigzag the other way as you tack or zigzag up the fall line of the slope, and your companions are going to follow you and come around the corner, and then you're going to change direction and go the other way. To do this in the 20th century, there was a technique called French technique that was sort of entrenched in the climbing establishment, which meant that you wore 10-point crampons, metal devices that you strap to the bottom of your boots that gives you purchase on the snow. And in French technique, you want to keep your 10 points in the snow all the time, unless you're walking forward, right? And you need to walk on the diagonal. You have a hinge in the middle so you can walk, and you come around a corner by doing a kick turn. Now, the steeper the slope gets, the more you have to roll your ankles down the fall line of the slope to keep all 10 points firmly attached to the snow so your feet don't go sliding out from underneath you. And this puts a lot of stress on your muscles and your skeletal structure. The steeper the slope gets, when you can't roll your ankles anymore, at that point you need to cut steps. And this was also a technique that had been used, developed in the 19th century in Europe. And it is exhausting because not only are you climbing uphill at elevation, but you're swinging your ice axe in front of you, chopping a step. And this is very taxing on your heart and on your lungs because you are using your legs and your arms at the same time. Now, in the mid-1950s, this was still a technique used throughout the mountains. This French technique, as taught by Gaston Rébuffat, perhaps one of the most famous French climber of all times, in his guidebook is showing you how you cut a step on snow and ice. And you can see he's chipping out a little platform so he can set his crampons flat into a flat area on the snow. And the steeper it gets, the more you have to be concerned that the whole team might go sliding off the hill if somebody takes a fall. So your 3-man rope team might have to put in a piece of protection. This means you would pound in an ice piton, or which you hammer into the snow or ice, and then it freezes into the snow or ice. Or you put in an ice screw that freezes, or if you're near rock, you pound in a rock piton. And you clip a carabiner, a snap link, onto your piece of protection, and then pass your rope through the carabiner so you can advance past that piece of protection and continue climbing up above it. So Omi-Daber A is going to put in a piece of protection about halfway up the slope while he's on belay by his companion Campbell on belay below. And then he will, Omi-Daber A will put in a piece of protection so he can belay his teammates up to him. Past that piece of protection that gets pulled out, and then everybody gathers together and you transfer all the hardware, all the protection, over to the lead climber, and then you go off the other way and you zigzag your way up the slope. Now, all of this takes a lot of time and effort, and it's dangerous. This is a picture on the left of Gaston Rébuffat on an impossibly steep slope, showing you French technique. You can see he has his protection strapped to his bandolier behind him, and he's put in a piece right behind his left foot. You can see his left foot is standing in a step with his right foot behind him as he chops a step in front of him. Here he is going up this staircase of cut steps with a piece of protection behind him. Now, this puts you at a very precarious angle, standing on a slope and trying to get your feet to go past each other on a steep slope while you're looking downhill. But on the right is an Austrian climber from the same time period. This is Karl Bloch, an Austrian climber. This is from the year 1952, and he is on the 10th ascent of the north face of the Eiger in Switzerland. And you can see that he is standing facing into the slope, and he's standing on his toes, and he's putting his piece of protection in front of him there. This is front pointing. And this is something that was developed in the interwar years by the German, the Swiss, and the Austrian climbers, as opposed to what the French climbers were doing, using a 12-point, not a 10-point crampon. The 12-point crampon has two extra prongs in the front that you can kick into the snow so you can stand on your toes and climb up. And they would weld that hinge that was part of a crampon so that you could walk. They'd weld that solid so that it was a straight platform, so that it was easier on your muscular system. Now, this is a picture of Dave Mahre's rigid crampons that he was using in the 60s. You can see that hinge has been totally eliminated, and it's just a solid platform that you can stand on the front of your toes. So with this method, you can climb anything. And this was what Marcel had learned in the interwar years in Germany. Now, he wanted to teach his young acolytes, like Dave Mahre and Gene Prater, how to do this so they could go up these steep routes with him. So he set up an ice climbing school in 1954 to teach him how to do it. This is Marcel on the left in some jaunty knickers. You can see that he has set two pieces of protection, one below, one above, and he is front pointing with this 12-point crampons, and he's using his ice hammer in his right hand to claw his way up this vertical pitch of ice. And he taught them something else, how to travel not with 3 people on a rope, but just 2. Here he is demonstrating for Dave Mahre's camera how you climb with a 2-man rope team. Down below, as Marcel climbs up, Gene Prater is going to belay him with a taut rope, keeping tension on the rope in case he falls. And Marcel will climb up to a safe place, or the full length of his rope, and put in a piece of protection so he's tied into the mountain, and then he's going to belay Gene as he comes up. There's his protection right there. This is what Marcel and Dave and Gene and Mike McGuire used on Liberty Ridge. Now, the red line there is Omi Daber's route, and he took a route up through the rocks as much as possible on Liberty Ridge. But Marcel wanted to go up as fast as he possibly could. So instead, he swung his team out to the west, out onto the snow to climb by front pointing and leapfrogging as much as possible. All the way up in that lower band of snow there till he met the red line, which is Omi Daber's line, at a rock outcropping called the Black Pyramid, and then continue on their way up to Liberty Cap on the snow and the ice. And Gene wrote that it was about 50 degrees and the ice was as hard as a rock on that lower part. So you can imagine it must have been terrifying and that they were putting in protection. Now, the way they would leapfrog is this way. I've just diagrammed it here. Let's say that Dave Mahre and Marcel Schuster are a two-man rope team. So Dave is on belay down below, and Marcel is going to start climbing above him. About halfway up the rope length, Marcel will put in a piece of protection and then a snap link and then pass the rope through it. And in that way, he can continue to climb past the protection. In case he takes a fall, he will fall down only as far on the rope length as it extends from that piece of protection. And with a dynamic rope, which stretches if there's a fall, instead of just stopping, it will stretch and absorb some of the shock. You can distribute the weight between Dave Mahre on belay and Marcel falling on that piece of protection. So Dave's still on belay in diagram 3. Marcel is at the full length of his rope. He sets up a new belay in diagram 4, and Dave starts climbing. Dave comes up and he removes that intermediate piece of protection. Then he comes up to where Marcel is on belay, says hi, but instead of stopping, he just keeps going. And he climbs right past Marcel, and he puts in another piece of intermediate protection and keeps climbing up, sets up a new belay in 9, and belays Marcel, who climbs up to him. And in this way, they just leap over one another, leapfrogging all the way up the mountain. So if we diagram this out to see what that actually looks like and why this was so revolutionary and why it's so important, this new technique that Marcel and Dave and Gene and Mike used in 1955, we have to look at the slope fall line that they were going up. Now, the fall line is the line that if you stood at the very top of the pyramid, and you dropped a tennis ball straight down, that's how the tennis ball would run down the mountain, straight down. That's the fall line. So if the middle line is where you are going to zigzag or tack up the mountain like Omi Daber did and like every other climbing group in North America was doing in 1955, you'd go this way, turn the corner and go this way, then turn the corner and go this way. But if you were with Marcel and Dave on Liberty Ridge that day in August 1955, you were leapfrogging. Dave would climb over Marcel. Marcel would climb over Dave. Dave would climb over Marcel, and they would just advance up the slope that way. Now, if we look at it a different way, the really important part of this is how you can travel quickly and avoid the objective dangers in mountaineering. And they are extremely high in the Cascades because the Cascades, for the most part, are volcanic rock, very friable and breakable, and full of glaciers and ice that wants to fall down on top of you and kill you. Liberty Ridge, all of these routes on the north side of Mount Rainier are extremely dangerous and prone to rock and icefall. So, if we look at the fall line, and that's the first thing that happened to the group as they stepped onto Liberty Ridge that morning in August 1955. They were hit with a shower of rock and gravel. Now, if you are doing the method that Omi Daber and just everybody else was doing, you can see that you're exposing yourself to more potential rock and ice fall as you climb up, rather than going straight up the way that Marcel and Dave did. Plus, you have to travel farther to go the same distance. So you are exposing yourself to more danger. So speed is of the essence on these climbs. This is essential. This was the essential lesson that Marcel taught to his young acolytes who were climbing with him. And this is what they did on Liberty Ridge. Now, at the end of the year, Gene tried to explain all of this to the mountaineers in Seattle, how they had front pointed with the welded crampons, how they were leapfrogging, clawing their way up, how efficient it was. The mountaineers weren't having it. They thought this was nuts, that the tried and true methods were the way to go. But this did not stop these guys. There was a collective of climbers up in Ellensburg, the Sherpa Climbing Club, and founded in part by Gene Prater and his brother Bill. And this was a club. This was not like the climbing clubs like the Mazamas or the Mountaineers or the Cascadians, where you call up somebody and say, I want to join. Who do I send my dues to? The Sherpas contacted you, and you were asked to join them. And these guys went out with these new skills that they were developing under the tutelage of Marcel, and they did some remarkable stuff. And they were very innovative, and they were constantly thinking about what they were doing and how to do it. And they were on the vanguard of climbing in North America. And by the time that mountaineering became the big business that it became in the 80s and the 90s and on into today, this is standard stuff. But they were doing it first. They developed it first. Now, Dave went on to do, some remarkable stuff. This is my favorite picture of Dave Mahre for a lot of reasons. This is a picture on the Adams Glacier. I have a warm spot in my heart for the Adams Glacier, of course. But here he is. He's front pointing, and he's leapfrogging with Gene Prater. And you can just tell he's in his element. The Adams Glacier has been a focal, a climb that the Cascadians were doing a lot back in the day. It's an advanced climb, and there's a lot of history tied up with the Cascadians and this north side of Mount Adams. But I also like this picture, and this is something as an historian that really grabs me, because in this day and age of tweets and emails and digital photographs that just disappear into the ether, I really despair for historians in the future. How are they going to put together histories of our era? Because everything will be gone. The beauty of this is this came out of Dave Mahre's own personal collection, thanks to Kathy. And on the back, he's written some notes about the climb, about how this is an example of front pointing and leapfrogging, and how he was climbing with Gene Prater. This is the stuff, ladies and gentlemen, that historians dream about, coming across this kind of stuff. But what's especially important here is to whom he has addressed these notes. It's Chris Jones. Do you remember Chris Jones? He was that guy on the Fun Hog trip in 1968. Dave is writing these notes to Chris Jones because Chris was from Great Britain, and he had moved to the Bay Area to work for IBM, and he just was infatuated with the Yosemite climbing scene and everything that was going on in North America. And in the early 70s, he decided he was going to write a history of climbing in North America. And this book is great. I mean, this is a phenomenal book. He did really great research on it. And this is the first book that acknowledged the influence of Dave Mahre and Marcel Schuster and Gene Prater and all of the Sherpa climbers, how they were so influential on the development of climbing in North America. This book came out in 1974. Now, on a personal note, what's really interesting about this book is when he was writing it, he had an assistant who was a graphic designer who helped him with the layout of the book. And this particular picture ended up on page 242. You can go home and look at it. And this assistant typed up the whole manuscript for him and helped him with the pictures. Her name was Betsy. She was his live-in girlfriend. After the book came out, he decided that he didn't want to have her as a live-in girlfriend anymore, which was a not smart thing for him to do, but really worked out well for me because I met Betsy on the rebound, and when we got married and moved up here in 1982, she became a really vibrant member of our community. And just a few hours ago, out at Snow Mountain Ranch, we dedicated a new trail in Betsy's memory, Betsy's Trail, just today. So, yeah, thank you. Thank you. So Dave went on with Gene and some of the other Sherpas to do remarkable climbs on rock, snow, and ice. He was a master of them all. This is the north face of Little Tahoma. Terrifying to look at. Terrifying to look at. And they climbed it in 1959. No big deal. They were over on the north face of Mount Stewart regularly, doing great climbs, and with a young Jim Wickwire, who will be here in a couple of weeks to talk to you. But the climb that really made his reputation and the one that obsessed him for the better part of a decade was the climb on Willis Wall. Now, in a couple of weeks, Jim Wickwire, who was on the trip, and Fred Dunham, who was with them as well, are going to come back and they are going to talk to you about this climb, and they are going to cover the history of Willis Wall. They'll cover the history of this climb, and it is going to be a great talk because it's something Wickwire's never done before. He's doing it especially for the museum. You really want to be here for it. It's going to be great. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about it so you can get primed and get your questions all lined up. Because it was a great climb. Dave got his first look at it on this Liberty Ridge climb, and he wrote to Chris Jones. He said, when I was on Liberty Ridge, I looked over at Willis Wall, and I knew I could do it. I knew I could climb it if I could just figure a way to get up it without getting killed. Because Willis Wall is about as dangerous a place as you can go on the planet. Willis Wall is bound on either side by the two main ridges on the north side of Mount Rainier, Liberty Ridge to the west, Curtis Ridge to the east. It's 4,000-foot vertical wall of volcanic rock, mud, and gravel. And overhanging the entire wall is a glacial cliff, ice cliff, that sends down seracs the size of boxcars periodically. On a danger level of 1 to 10, you'd probably have to dial it up to 12 over on Willis Wall. Perfect for Dave. He analyzed this climb for years. He made 3 attempts to go up it unsuccessfully. One of them, Fred Beckey, got wind of it and was sniffing out a first descent that he could notch on his belt and came along on one of them, but they got weathered out. He got Ralph Uber, another mountaineer from Yakima who was a pilot, to fly him around Rainier and back and forth by the wall so he could get a good look at it from the air. And he figured out that the East Rib was going to be the way to go. And Jim Wickwire, I just talked to Jim Wickwire just a few days ago, and he goes, the East Rib, that should be Mahre's Rib. That should be named after Dave Mahre. But this was the route that he chose, swung it over towards Curtis Ridge, and then up through the snow, across what Dave called the Traverse of the Angels, and over to a gap in the ice cliff, up to Liberty Cap. Now, how many of you out there have actually climbed Mount Rainier? See a show of hands. So, what's it feel like when you're done? Are you tired? Does it take a while to recover? I know if I just go up the lollipop routes, it takes me a couple of months to recover from that, my feet especially. But Dave and a group, just to see if they were tough enough to go up Willis Wall, the week before, they decided to go up from the west side, up the Edmonds Glacier, and they ended up getting lost and putting in a first descent on the way, just to see if they were tough enough to come back a week later to climb Willis Wall, and to go over Liberty Cap and look down the route to see if it's going to go. No big deal. Now remember, this is 1963, and they're not using lightweight gear, right? And they don't have the advantage of what we have today, right? This is heavy stuff. These guys were hardcore, I want to tell you. I mean, I know a lot of people that think they're tough. They're not Dave Mahre tough, okay? Anyway, they went up the Edmonds Glacier head wall 1 week, and a week later they came back to go up Willis Wall. And when Fred and Jim take the stage, they are going to tell you, I'm sure, about this route up the Edmonds Glacier head wall. They will tell you how they came in from the west side and came up to Carbon River, or the Carbon Glacier, and up the route on the Willis Wall to Liberty Cap. How their descent route was supposed to be down the Emmons, but ended up going down the other way. Now remember that this all took place when Whitaker and Prather and their crew, they were all over on Mount Everest, and nobody was really caring too much about what was going on the north side of Mount Rainier. But there was, because of Lex Maxwell, of course, who was always a promoter of climbing in this area, made sure that the paper knew that Dave Mahre had led a team up Willis Wall. And Lex said that this was the greatest mountaineering achievement of this generation. Rightly so. And Dave himself, when he got back home, he said, my family's got to put up with a lot living with a mountain climber. A lot of true statements in this article. But the most bizarre one was by the author himself. I just do not understand at all what he was talking about here. I've never seen a conflation of ice cream and mountaineering ever. But nonetheless, Dave Mahre and Jim Wickwire, Don Anderson, and Fred Dunham made this complete ascent of Willis Wall up the East Rib on 8th of June, 1963. Now, Fred and Jim allowed me to show you a few pictures, sort of a teaser for what's coming. This is a picture of Dave leading a short pitch on the East Rib with Don Anderson smiling and the sun shining on the rocks. This is all going to change later in the day. This is a great picture of, oops, let's go back here. Sorry, hit the wrong button. This is a great picture of Dave going up the snowfield above the East Rib. It looks like he's kind of walking up the Palma Hill at White Pass, but this is foreshortened, And this is actually vertical. And, gosh. And right there, you see the ice cliffs up there where the arrow is. The arrow is where they're headed for. That's the low point in the ice wall. This looks like the ice wall is fallen back, but it actually is overhanging the rock. So you can imagine how terrifying that must have been. I mean, it's terrifying to me. So they climbed up into a whiteout for some reason, probably to save weight. I don't know why. No one had a compass. In the whiteout, they couldn't see which way to go, and so I think Fred just headed on down, and because Don Anderson was suffering from high altitude sickness, and they knew they had to get him down, and they ended up going down the west side of the mountain. And this is a picture that Jim just sent me of their bivouac on the South Mowich River on the 9th of June. They look a little exhausted to me. But here they are, driving through Enumclaw, feeling a little better. Dave still has his glacier glasses on because he had sunburned his eyes trying to figure out their route on the day before, so his eyes were a little sandy. Anyway, you'll learn more about that in a couple of weeks, and I really hope you'll come and listen. When I talked to Dave back in the late 80s, I was interviewing him about Marcel, and he told me that recognition of Marcel's stature as this influence on climbing in the United States was long overdue. This is back in the 80s. And other people have said that the same thing about Dave Mahre, that he never got the recognition that he deserved in his lifetime. So with this lecture, with our exhibit, with the book that we have produced, I really hope that we can rectify that situation and get get these guys recognized as these pioneering mountaineers, very influential in this wonderful sport of mountaineering in North America. I really hope you come next on June 29th to hear Wickwire and Dunham tell you hair-raising tales of climbing on Willis Wall. And thank you so much for your patience tonight and for coming to listen to me. Thank you very much. I hope you also take a chance, if it's still open, to go up and look at the exhibit. It is amazing. It's really wonderful. Thanks so much.